Okay, our next speaker this afternoon, topic fondly on my radar. Chali Simpson is a PhD student in the Forest Carbon Ecology Lab at Texas A&M University, specializing in grazing and carbon dynamics, grassland ecology, and sustainable grazing management. Their research focuses on quantifying soil carbon sequestration and adaptive multi-paddock grazing, AMP, you might hear it said. Adaptive multi-paddock grazing systems compared to continuous grazing in North Texas. By integrating field-based carbon flux measurements, isotope analysis, eddy covariance, things we talk about at supper every night, and the temporary integrative mass balance carbon association model, they assess carbon inputs and outputs to determine the role of AMP grazing in enhancing soil carbon retention and mitigating climate change. And I've been on one of the ranches that she uses, and it's a great operation. But this is so intensive grazing, you got to be married to this system when you're rotating 3 and 4 times a day. But Carrie, welcome.
So thank you for the introduction and the opportunity to come today. What a great way to spend a Saturday. I'm very grateful for that, so thank you. As Mr. Linux kindly mentioned, my name is Chali Simpson, and I'm a PhD student at Texas A&M in College Station. Woo! And the overall objective of my dissertation is to look at how adaptive multi-paddock, or AMP grazing, which is a conservation-based grazing strategy, and its role in potentially improving our soil carbon sequestration and improving rangeland resiliency. Before we dive too much into the research, I just want to spend a moment of gratitude to this society, to the Native Plant Society of Texas. Thank you so much for your crucial support in supporting this research. Your commitment to conserving native plant species, as well as implementing sustainable land management, aligns perfectly with the goal of this study. I'd also like to quickly thank my advisors, our many undergraduate assistants, and the participating landowners. It really takes a village to make a research project like this come to life. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. With rising levels of greenhouse gases and increasing extreme climate change, this call to implement sustainable land management is more important than ever, especially on grassland ecosystems, which cover a vast area of our terrestrial landscape, and they hold over 1/3 of our terrestrial soil carbon stocks, making these ecosystems a very important component to the balance of our global carbon cycle. And unlike what we consider more stable carbon sink ecosystems like forest lands, grasslands are highly dynamic, with their ability to hold or release carbon depending on changing climatic conditions, changing land use management, as well as their inherent soil properties. And although this variability can make these ecosystems vulnerable, it also produces a lot of opportunity. When we implement regenerative grazing strategies or adaptive grazing strategies that are rooted in the 4 principles of soil health, we can actually transition these grassland ecosystems into long-term soil carbon sinks, whether that's through reduced bare ground disturbance, improving our soil cover, improving our hydrologic function through water infiltration and water holding capacity, and as well as improving our soil organic matter formation. But to really maximize on these benefits, we have to understand how to implement targeted and especially adaptive grazing to these changing ecological and anthropogenic pressures. And so one conservation-based approach is called adaptive multi-paddock, or AMP grazing, and it's different than just rotational grazing, moving your cattle from one pasture to another, as it's continuously adjusting the stocking rate, or number of cattle in a pasture, the amount of time that they graze a pasture, and more importantly, landowners incorporate long recovery periods to ensure pasture sustainability. And this is in terms of changing climatic conditions and forage availability. And this rotation and the amount of rest, it mimics the natural grazing movement of wild ungulates like bison, who historically formed these diverse, healthy, carbon-rich grasslands. And, sorry, I meant to bring that up. And so landowners that are implementing these practices are often accomplishing their ecological goals, whether that be improved native plant diversity, improved hydrologic functions such as water infiltration, as well as improved soil microbial and plant interaction. So we're starting to see this higher carbon sequestration. However, this effectiveness in the literature is still being debated. And there's a couple of challenges that might arise that cause this, whether that be, the study durations are too short. Processes like these take a long time sometimes, or they aren't able to acknowledge legacy land disturbances if there was, previous land uses before the grazing actually occurred. Or lastly, and most commonly, they impose too rigid of grazing designs for, to replicate in the science. That doesn't necessarily reflect the true nature of adaptive multi-paddock grazing and the adaptiveness of the system. And so the purpose of this study was to overcome some of those methodological constraints and challenges and advance the debate on the academic debate on AMP grazing by implementing a high resolution approach to tracking carbon. And if we can do this successfully, we're able to kind of predict how the grazing system can improve carbon sequestration at the ranch scale. And so what the purpose of the study was to quantitatively compare carbon sequestration through an annual soil carbon balance between 2 AMP and conventional grazing systems. So conventional meaning they're leaving their pasture they're leaving their cattle in a pasture year round. And our hypothesis was that AMP systems would show higher annual soil carbon gain and therefore create larger carbon sinks when compared to leaving your cattle in the pasture year round. And how we did this, how we developed our carbon budget, it looks similar to this conceptual model on the right, where we quantified and measured our major carbon inputs highlighted in the green, such as the amount of grass that grew over the year, the amount of finer biomass production and mortality added as a carbon input, as well as manure production. And then we also looked at major carbon outputs, like what we call heterotrophic respiration, which in other words means microbial. So the bacteria, fungi, what kind of respiration are they showing? And then lastly, looking at the amount of biomass that was utilized by the cattle. And what we're hoping to see in the AMP is that those carbon inputs have more weight than the outputs, and we start to see more formation of permanent or more resistant soil carbon stocks in the soil. And so how we did this is we selected 2 AMP and continuous ranch operations in 2 distinctive ecoregions of Texas, one in the rolling plains and one in the Blackland prairies. These ecoregions they're about 200 miles apart, and they differ in about 400 millimeters per precipitation, as well as their soil types. So in the west, we have more of a sandy mollisol, and in the east, we have more of a clay alphasol. And this table just quickly highlights just some key grazing differences between the operations, with the AMP system in the west being, as Mr. Linux was talking about, they are a high stock density, short duration operation. They graze 5,000 head of stockers in a single pasture for about a day. And this is paired with a continuous grazer that's very lightly stocked. And then in the east, we have a more moderately stocked AMP system that grazes a pasture about 10 days on average, paired with a very high stock density continuous system. And more importantly, highlighted in the red is the amount of rest that each pasture receives in AMP. So in the west, we have about 110 days per pasture of rest on average, and then about 75 days per pasture of rest. And you can really begin to see this when you step out onto the landscape with higher green biomass production across the whole year in AMP, compared to more like standing dead in our western continuous system that was very lightly stocked. So this is almost like a rest system. And then in the east, we see a lot of like invasive, less palatable species with our very high stock density. So a lot of cattle, all year round. And what this looks like is we measured, we took monthly measurements from May 2022 to May 2023. We measured 3 replicates per pasture across 3 pastures per ranch. And this is what my annual soil carbon balance equation looks like. It's, yeah, it's a lot. It's measured in grams carbon per meter squared for the year. We did acknowledge that there was a lot of factors that could play into this. In fact, there's probably more than I listed. But we tried to just identify the major components to measure on the monthly basis. And the ones that we chose were the net primary production of above ground biomass. And we used these grazing exposures. So we would actually clip, inside and outside those grazing exposures to look at biomass grazed. The second one would be fine root mortality, where we took 30 centimeter depth soil cores and actually quantified every root that I collected. The second one would be manure production. So I actually had a belt transect where I would walk and count and actually collect and bring the manure back. Then moving into our major carbon outputs, I had heterotrophic respiration. So again, it's that microbial component. And we did that using our portable survey chamber and portable Ergosin system. So it actually measures the CO2 coming out of the ground. And as I'll discuss in a little bit, how we partitioned it into microbial and plant roots. And then lastly, looking at grazed biomass, we also used those grazing exposures. And then finally, we did look at continuous weather station data to see how climatic conditions were impacting these carbon fluxes. And so this is my soil carbon inputs. Again, this is at an annual scale. And we're looking at grams carbon per meter squared. The blue is highlighting the western pair, green is highlighting the east, with the lighter colors being the AMP systems and darker colors representing the continuous. And the first component I want to talk about is the above ground net primary production. At the annual scale, we did not actually see a significant difference between the AMP and continuous, but we did see a significant difference between the ecoregions with higher biomass in the west, which was actually kind of surprising considering the increased precipitation favoring the east. Looking at root mortality, again, it was similar across not only the ecoregion, but also the grazing systems. And then finally, our manure production was the only significant different soil carbon input, with the high stock density grazing all year round, continuous grazer in the east being the highest. And this is just a direct function of the number of cows and the amount of days that they had grazed. When we move into our carbon outputs, I want to briefly talk about how we partitioned microbial from plant root respiration. And we did this by collecting signature isotopes of total soil respiration. So that's both plant and root. And microbial exhibits a slightly more negative delta carbon 13 value. And what we see in this Keeling plot, which is just highlighting those values, the AMP was consistently more negative, meaning there was much more microbial respiration compared to plant root. And what we can infer from this is that there's higher soil microbial activity going on and potentially greater soil health as well. But when we applied this contribution to our total heterotrophic respiration, again, we see that they're still pretty similar across grazing strategies and ecoregions. And then finally, looking at our biomass grazed, the continuous was, again, significantly higher, but this is, the number of cattle grazing all year round. So they're simply just eating more than AMP systems. When you look at the final value, so this is when you've added up all of your carbon inputs and subtracted them from your carbon outputs, this figure is supposed to help us identify if those sites are in fact sequestering or releasing carbon at the ecosystem level. And what we see, I guess the first thing I want to point out is that there are large standard error bars. And this is highlighting this very high spatial heterogeneity even within pastures. So trying to quantify carbon dynamics, especially at this scale, is very complex. And this tended to, I guess, mask any significant effect that we could see, but we can still see clear trends with 3 of the 4 ranches showing these negative values, meaning they were, in fact, carbon sources, meaning they had a net carbon loss. But our high stock density AMP system with the 5,000 head of stockers was actually carbon neutral. So it was hanging on to the amount of carbon that it was inputting. Last thing I want to highlight is the magnitude of which there is carbon loss. And I think part of the reason is when I listed that long equation, I think that we needed to probably implement a couple more of those soil carbon inputs, but due to time and labor limitations, that was pretty difficult. But I really think that's what's driving that magnitude loss. If we had incorporated maybe soil fungal production as a carbon input, that would have been a little closer to 0 as well. When we place this soil carbon sequestration in terms of the climate that was happening during this year, this is a US drought monitor, and it showed that both regions were actually going through an extreme drought throughout the duration of the study. So when you place these soil carbon sequestration results in light of that, it shows that AMP was able to retain more carbon under an extreme drought year compared to continuous systems in both ecoregions, which is significant and great for the landowner. And then finally, when we look at in that conceptual model, when I talked about, if we're in fact able to get more inputs, maybe we can store more carbon in the soil through organic carbon stocks. And a colleague of mine actually did that. He took soil samples in the top 10 centimeters. And the thing I want to highlight is that my carbon fluxes, which is the movement of carbon throughout the ecosystem, represented 5 to 10% of the actual stock that's in the soil. So in fact, this process is a lot more dynamic than we had first expected. So just to kind of conclude and have some key takeaways, when we look at this in terms of extreme drought years, the AMP system was able to hold on to more carbon through primarily more rest for each pasture. So we were able to improve carbon retention and resiliency in extreme droughts. And as I mentioned through our isotope analysis, we potentially have higher microbial activity and improved soil health, which kind of acts like a buffer for the landowner when they experience an extreme drought. And then lastly, just highlighting again the high pasture variability, just meaning that this process and trying to quantify this is still very complex. And moving forward, what we're trying to help minimize those error bars by, one, we're going to include more soil carbon inputs this year. We've actually started for the year 2024. We're about 6 months in. So we're looking at more carbon inputs such as fungal production. And we're also looking at ecosystem carbon fluxes using eddy covariance towers, as you can see in the top right, which is looking at the dynamics of carbon at the pasture scale instead of within just 3 spots per pasture. And then what we'll do is take all of this information and model the internal plant carbon dynamics. So what's actually going on inside of the plant itself at the ecosystem level. And that way we can have a more complete picture. So first study was soil down. Now the second study with the eddy covariance is looking across the pasture. And my third study will be looking at what's actually happening inside the plant. And this year is actually shaping up to be a less drought year. So we'll actually get to compare 2 different types of climatic conditions as well. And so with that, I will take any questions. Thank you. So the first thing is, oh, I'm sorry. Yes. So we did ask about this figure on the left with the annual soil carbon balance and why the error bar might potentially be wider or bigger for the AMP system in the west. And I think it is, we can point this definitely to the spatial heterogeneity, whether that be, we did our best to try and pick the same soil types within the pastures, but that's very difficult. That pasture was covered in many soil series. So the potential to hold carbon might be a little bit different within the pastures, but also just the nature of how they graze. Some pastures received more grazing throughout that year and others didn't. And so I think just the dynamic way that they grazed made it a little bit difficult to quantify, if that makes sense. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. So the question is, did I identify all of the plants? Short answer is yes. So we actually took probably 10 frames per pasture every month. And I wish I could show this data. I'm actually still working through it. But what we looked at was the soil surface characteristics. So we actually identified how much bare ground, live cover, litter was on the soil surface. The second thing we identified was what the cover of plant functional groups were. So of that frame, how much what percentage covered was perennial grass, perennial forbs, annual forbs, perennial forbs, and then woody species. And then we also did identify species. So I think we brought home 1,200 samples, and that's not all that we took. So we're still processing that. But yeah, we're hoping to show that the community dynamics as well. And I think that's going to play a huge role in understanding those final results. Yes, ma'am. Oh, thank you. So she said to please come back. And I wanna really highlight how much I appreciate your support, because not only did you help me with the first project, but you've helped me with the eddy covariance. And so hopefully when I graduate in a year, I will have 3 publications that this society has been crucial in helping with. So I will absolutely come back if you'll have me. Oh, sorry. Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. Yes, ma'am. So she asked if prescribed fire or even wildfire was playing a role, maybe historically or currently. And what I can say is, I don't think I can't speak to the historical. What I can speak to is the landowners have had these properties for at least a decade and have been managing it this way for at least a decade. Some of them do burn, some of them don't. I think 3 of the 4 do not. The only one that did was the AMP in the eastern. And he currently does, but he tried his best to avoid my study because I didn't want that playing a part. I just wanted to look at grazing impacts, if that makes sense. Oh, sorry, I keep doing that. So the question was, in order to implement AMP, do you have to buy more acreage or reduce your herd? And not necessarily. So the AMP system in the West, I think, was 14,000 acres, and they had 5,000 head of stockers, which I haven't heard of an operation quite like them. And they had like 400 subdivisions in terms of pastures. So they would actually rotate every 2 hours to a day. But so I feel like they're probably the exceptional AMP in terms of the definition of AMP. But the Eastern AMP system, they only had like, I think, 1,000 to 2,000 acres and maybe 200 head of cattle. So it's really how the landowner wants to take it. The primary goal of this is to understand your plant community, to be able to read the landscape and go, should I move here? Should I move there? Based off of the plant system, but more importantly, incorporating rest. So if you could just increase your rotation, but be mindful of how you're rotating. Go ahead. Yes, ma'am. Did I come from a ranching family? Previously, yes. I actually, I come from a rodeo family, and I grew up showing livestock, but my great-grandparents and grandparents used to ranch. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you all. We're going to move on.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. Well done.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Come back.
Thank you. Oh.